do that now. And I'm going to switch the view to speaker. And bear with me as I just repeat briefly where I started. We're in chapter 25, just after the story of Bilam. Israel was staying at Shittim. They're about to enter the promised land. The people profane themselves by whoring with Midianite Moabite women who invited the people to the sacrifice for their God. They ate the sacrifice, they worshiped the God. Thus, Israel attached itself to Baal Peor, who is the god of the Moabites, and God was incensed. So Baal Peor, Baal is the Canaanite god, the head of the Canaanite pantheon of gods, and is a god of fertility, God who brings rain. And of course, unlike Egypt, which was dependent on the Nile, the land of Israel is completely dependent on rain. And when the rain doesn't fall, there's famine. It's terrible. In fact, if you think about the Shema, right, and the second paragraph of the Shema, if you earnestly heed what I tell you, you obey God, then you'll get rain in its season, the former rain and the latter rain. But if not, then the consequences will be that the land will dry up. Right? So rain is something that you need, and it was common for people to offer sacrifices, Canaanites, to the god Baal in order that there be rain so that they could have their crops. So God this is an agricultural society, and that's worth noting also because the Canaanites are an agricultural people, but the Israelites have been leading for 40 years in nomadic existence. So they're not used to agriculture. They're encountering this Canaanite god for the first time. Now the god is Baal Peor. Peor is the name of a place, right? So one way of seeing this is Baal at Peor, right? And we see in a variety of places, even in the stories of the patriarchs, God, and in some other literature outside of the Bible, God is also sometimes, our God, Adonai, is mentioned in relation to a particular place, Beit El, for example. And the idea is that these are places where the God has made an appearance. So this is the God, and therefore a temple is often built there. All right, so they are there, they're on the verge of the promised land, but they are seduced by these Moabite women. And so I mentioned earlier that it's interesting that this passage, which really deals with Pinchas, which is the subject of the next Torah portion, is here at the end of the parsha, which deals with Bilam and Balak. And the rabbis, looking at this conjunction, say that Bilam had advised Balak, look, I can't curse this people, but I will give you a way to get it there. Have your women entice them into idolatry. And therefore their God will desert them, and therefore you will be successful in uprooting them. Now, it's not at all in the text, but it may be that one of the reasons that this, just the beginning of chapter 25, is joined here to this parsha is that connection. So the idea of non-Jewish women, pagan women, enticing Jewish men away from the worship of our God is a theme that runs through biblical literature. And the classic example of it is King Solomon, of all people. We know that King Solomon married a great many women. This is how, I think I've mentioned this before, this is how he extends his kingdom. He makes marital alliances with the other nations around the nation of Israel. These foreign wives come to Jerusalem, and temples are built for them so that they can go worship there, and this becomes a problem. There is a sense that later on, when the Jewish people returns from exile, remember the Babylonians destroy the temple in the year 586 before the Common Era. The Babylonians are defeated by the Persians. The Persians allow the Israelites now to come back and rebuild the temple. And one of the leaders of that return is Ezra. And one of the things that Ezra does is he forces the Israelites who have intermarried to divorce and send away their non-Israelite wives. There is a sense that this is just too tempting, right? So we have this idea of the Israelites being seduced away from the worship of God. God gets angry, right? And what that generally means in the Bible is that there's a plague. So this is a deep violation, right? We are told in the Ten Commandments that God is a zealous or jealous God. We as a people are not allowed to have anyone other than God. And we're going to see here in this story also, there's a sense that it's similar to the apostasy of the golden calf. This and this happens right on the verge of the people entering the land. Okay, so what happens? And by the way, they're invited to eat sacrifices, and they eat them. So what happens? God says to Moses, take the ringleaders and have them publicly impaled before the Lord so that the Lord's wrath may turn from Israel. Okay? So the ringleaders here, it says ringleaders, but the Hebrew is actually Roshei Ha'am, the leaders of the people, not just the ringleaders. And I think that's important for a reason I'll mention in a minute. But what does it mean to be impaled? Right? You might think that being impaled means that you should be executed by being impaled. But it's clear throughout biblical literature that that's not what it means. What it means is that you are executed in another way, and then you are displayed, your corpse is displayed, which is, first of all, it's sort of degrading to you. It's an additional part of the punishment, and it becomes a kind of warning for other people. See what happened to these people as a result of what they did. There's a law in the book of Exodus that says you may not allow a body to hang in this kind of impalement beyond one day. When the sun goes down, they have to be taken down and buried. Right? So it's clear that the two things are separate, which, by the way, if you were paying attention during the Megillah reading this past week, you know, they keep talking about this gallows and where Haman is hung. It's the same thing. His body is being displayed. We actually see, and I think someone asked me about this last time, right? We see first his sons are killed, and then they're displayed. It's not the same thing. Okay. Anyway, the point here is, despite the fact that it says ringleaders, it really means the head of the people, which is exactly the opposite of ringleaders. which is to say, the heads of all the tribes, right? All of the officials. And that means not just the guilty, but also the innocent. Right? And God is saying, well, you got to do something to assuage my anger, and this is what God says. So Moses says to Israel's officials, each of you slay those of his men who are attached to Baal Peor. In other words, Moses is not actually doing what God sent him to do. He's modifying what God asked, and he's modifying it by saying, essentially, why should the innocent perish together with the guilty? Now, this in itself, though, is more limited than what we've seen in the past, where God is essentially striking out at the whole people. Here, God is not striking out against the people as a whole. It's more specific, and Moses makes it even more specific. What happens? Just then, one of the Israelites came and brought a Midianite woman over to his companions in the sight of Moses and the whole Israelite people, who were weeping at the entrance to the tent of meeting. When Pinchas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, saw this, he left the assembly, and taking a spear in his hand, he followed the Israelite into the chamber and stabbed both of them, the Israelite and the woman, through the belly, and the plague was checked. Right? So Pinchas, who is there, right, sees this terror, right? I mean, this is public, right? They're going in, they're having sex, they're having it right there in the outskirts or perhaps just inside the tabernacle. So this is extraordinarily blatant, and it's public. So why are they doing this? I mean, if it's just a question of having sex, so not the best place to have it. This seems to be some kind of a ritual act. And I would remind you that Baal Peor is a god of fertility. So this may be some kind of way of enacting what they want Baal to do, to bring down the rain, or in this case, what the man will provide, to provide fertility. At any rate, it is, a tremendous public violation. And what happens? Pinchas gets up, takes a spear, goes in, and kills them. And as a result, the plague of the Israelites was checked, but still 24,000 people died. Right, so this is in itself, I think, disturbing. And Pinchas is a difficult figure, right? Because, well, I would say one thing. Remember that he's a Levite, and the job of the Levites, in part, was to guard the tabernacle. Right? So he is not just some guy. He is a person who is supposed to be controlling access. And that, I think, is part of what goes on here. The rabbis are troubled by this because there's no judicial procedure. Right? They're not hauled before a court. Pinchas simply goes in. Now you could say, well, it's a very public crime and everything else, but the rabbis don't like it. And they say that they would have tried him and found him guilty, were it not for the fact that we'll see in a minute that God approves of what he did. Now, the problem with what Pinchas did is, in part, that it sets a terrible example. It's, well, at least potentially. So I want to give you two ways in which Pinchas has inspired later people. And for the first one, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Why isn't that going, and oops, I've got to go to give you the right screen. And that is, where is it? No. Oh, I know where it is. Okay, here it is. Okay. First Maccabees, chapter 2, verses 23 to 27. So we know the story of one of the earliest sources we have for the story of Hanukkah is from the books of Maccabees. I think I've mentioned before, Maccabees is not part of our Bible. It is part of something called the Apocrypha, which was a later collection of non-canonical works. It's preserved within the Christian Bible, where it's part, for example, of the Catholic Bible, but it's not part of ours, ironically, because we celebrate Hanukkah and they don't. So the story of Maccabees tells how a non-Jewish king is now oppressing, right? Antiochus is oppressing the Jewish people and forcing them to offer sacrifices to him. And so he sends soldiers to the town of Modin, right? And they order the people to come forward and to eat of this sacrifice. And when the head of the soldiers had finished speaking this, a Jew came forward in the sight of all to offer sacrifice on the altar at Modin according to the king's command. When Mattathias saw it, he burned with zeal. His heart was stirred. He gave vent to righteous anger. He ran and killed him at the altar. At the same time, he killed the king's officer who was forcing the sacrifice. He tore down the altar. Thus, he burned with zeal for the law, just as Pinchas did against Zimri, the son of Salu. And then Mattathias calls out in the crowd, in the town, with a loud voice, let everyone who is zealous for the Lord, law and supports the covenant come with me, right? So see how Pinchas now inspires, and it's very close, right? It's about people eating sacrifices to a non-Jewish God. It is about, just as Zimri, who was a Jew, who was partaking of this sacrifice and more, is slaughtered by Pinchas. Here, following his example, we have Mattathias, who of course is the father of Judah Maccabee, starts the Maccabean revolt here. Okay, let me go back to I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. Okay. And I'm going to give you one other example also in a minute, but I realize I haven't really stopped for questions or comments. So I want to change to the gallery view. And if anyone does have a question or comment before we go on, I'm happy to take them. Sandy, and then Saul.
So Rabbi, this reminds me, excuse me, what you just shared the screen with Phineas, that all are with me fight, something like that. When after the golden calf, I don't remember it was Moses or Aaron said something, and they went through the camp, killing all the people that were.
Yes. Now here, that doesn't actually happen. And this is striking, I think. In other words, God says, get all the leaders and kill them. Moses says, kill the people who actually participated, right? Not the leaders who are innocent. And now we have essentially the plague being assuaged by Pinchas. And so no one else is killed, actually, except the plague's been going on, but no one else is killed except these two people. And that ends it, right? So in some ways, this is different from that. Whereas in the case of the golden calf, Aaron and the Levites go and slaughter lots of people. Okay, other questions, comments on this? More? No, Saul, and then Maureen.
First of all, the word zealot, what is that word in Hebrew? Because, Pinchas is referred to as Pinchas as zealot.
It's kana, right? Zealotry is being impassioned for God. And God is also described as Elkanah. God is a zealous God who does not forgive idolatry, right? Because it's a violation of the covenant. We have, as it were, a marital relationship with God, and adultery, worshiping another God, is like a form of adultery. So what Pinchas does is in some ways take on God's zeal and therefore assuasion. Maureen, do you have a question? Unmute, please.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm embarrassed to ask this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I lost track of what God is so furious about.
Oh, he's furious because the Israelites are worshiping this pagan god,
Okay.
right? And then, right, they're dallying with the Midianites. They're worshiping this pagan god, and they're doing it right on the edge of the promised land, right? So this act of idolatry, sort of in God's face, after everything, is really what pushes this strong reaction from God.
Okay. Thank you.
Other comments? So I said, we saw, right, that the Maccabean revolt against the Syrian Greeks begins with someone who is imitating. Unfortunately, in modern times, we also have someone who viewed what Pinchas did as an inspiration. And that is a much more tragic story, because his name was Baruch Goldstein. Some of you may remember. Baruch Goldstein, who went in Hebron to a mosque and slaughtered people who were just there praying. And he said, right, he actually cites Pinchas as a kind of, example. So this kind of zealotry, but here in Pinchas, he at least seems to be in some ways inspired, and also Mattathias, but it's problematic. I feel, they used to have these commercials, for cars, and there would be this disclaimer: professional driver, do not try this, right? Right. This is not a good example for people to be following. Sandy, did you look like you're raising your hand? You have to unmute.
So Rabbi, if I understood you correctly, in the beginning, you said that Balaam said to Balak that, the curse didn't work, but he gave him another idea of how he could.
Right. That's just a midrash. Right?
Okay, because I find that surprising in the sense that Balaam blessed the people. I mean, didn't anything rub off on him?
Right. So, the rabbis are just playing around. I think.
Okay, thank you.
But what's striking to them is the juxtaposition of these two passages, right? In other words, we just finished the story of Bilam, and here we are with this story. So what connects them? And so they create this midrash that says, oh, Bilam gave advice, right? He couldn't do what he was asked to do, but he gives advice. Okay. At any rate, we're going to jump ahead now to God's response. And now you can pass over the Haftorah if you're following in the book that has started. And we're going to pick up with verse 10, right? And here we have Pinchas. And let me go back to speaker view. Okay, so the Lord spoke to Moses saying, Pinchas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, has turned back my wrath from the Israelites by displaying among them his passion, right? For me, right? And that's that same root again, kana, right? so that I did not wipe out the Israelite people in my passion. He had passion for me, and so in my passion, I spared them, and therefore I grant him Brit Shalom, right? Literally a covenant of peace. It shall be for him and his descendants after him a pact of priesthood for all time, because he took impassioned action for his God, making expiation for the Israelites. So God seems to be pleased with this and pleased with Pinchas. He gives him this covenant of peace. This doesn't exist anywhere else. It's hard to know exactly what it is. There are those who see this as, in an ironic way, a kind of condemnation, that Pinchas is now allowed. He, in some ways, loses his zeal, right? He becomes more peaceful, but God seems to be saying, "I'm pleased with him." He made expiation. In other words, it's a kind of a more. God had told Moses, "You can make expiation, right? You can somehow help to." I'm looking for the right word, right? You can do a smaller act to prevent a bigger act, right? So he says, God says, get rid of the leaders of the people. Moses says to the leaders, no, just get rid of the guilty. And here expiation comes in a very smaller way and from people who are clearly guilty. So Pinchas is in some ways rewarded for this. One more comment about this, because I'm really struck by it. So you might think Pinchas is getting this Brit Shalom, and therefore rabbinic literature and later the Jewish people will regard this as a positive thing, what he did, even though, as we see in modern times, it's problematic. I'm struck by a very famous statement of the rabbis. We find it in Pirkei Avot, that chapter of the Mishnah that deals with ethics. And it is, be among the followers of Aaron who pursue peace and lead people to the Torah, right? Loves peace, you should love peace, you should pursue peace and draw people closer to God, essentially. It's really interesting to me that it's Aaron who's chosen. That's the example that we should follow, right? Because the new priest is going to be Pinchas. You could easily say, be among the followers of Pinchas and have zeal for God. It's not what the rabbis want. This image of Aaron, who is the peacemaker, is the model that they want us to follow. And this, I mentioned the parallel here, explicit, with Maccabees. I think it's not surprising in light of all this that the book of Maccabees does not make it into the canon, right? It's not part of our Bible. The story of Hanukkah doesn't make it into the Mishnah. It's among the laws that are codified in the first law code, no mention of it. It's only later in the latter part of the Talmud that it comes up, and all that we know about Hanukkah is brought forward. Right there, and then of course on Hanukkah we read a Haftorah, Lo b'chayil v'lo b'koach ki im beruchi, not by military might, but through my spirit, says God. I think the rabbis want to downplay Pinchas and Mattathias for that reason. Be among the followers, the students of Aaron. Okay, so now we get the name of the Israelite who was killed. The one who was killed with the Midianite woman was Zimri, the son of Salu, chieftain of the Shemonite ancestral house, right? So he's a head. He's not just a guy, right? He's a leader, right? He is Nasi, Bet Av L'Shimon. So the tribe of Shimon, and he's a leader. So that's part of this too, right? He's not just some guy. This act of having, it's like the governor. Right? When the governor goes and flagrantly violates the law and everybody's watching, it's certainly much more serious. And who is he with? Cosby, the daughter of Tsur. He was a tribal head of the ancestral house in Midian, right? So we have two A-list people who go into the tabernacle, or at least the outskirts of the tabernacle, and that's what causes all of this. Okay, then God says to Moses, go against the Midianites and defeat them. They assailed you by the trickery they practiced against you because of the affair of Pa'ur, the affair of their kinswoman Cosby, and a daughter of the Midianite chieftain who was killed at the time of the plague on the war. Okay, and now we don't actually get an account of that. What we get here now is a census, right? Because they're going in. They're really ready now, getting ready to go into the promised land. A lot has happened. People have died in the wilderness. A whole generation has died off. As you undoubtedly recall, the scouts had been sent in. They thought they were going in. As a result of what happened with the scouts, that whole generation had to perish. So now, how many people are there? From the age of 20 years up, because those are the people who will be fighting. By their ancestral houses, all Israelites able to bear arms, and Moses and Eleazar, the priest, the steppes of Moab, at the Jordan, near Jericho, give instructions about them, those from 20 years up, as the Lord had commanded Moses. And now we get the census, right? So we began this book with the census, and now as we come into the land of Israel, we get yet another census. I'm not going to go through all of them, all the parts of it. I do want to look at, there is a little bit of a kind of an illusion here. If you look at beginning at verse 9, the sons of Eliav were Nemuel and Datan and Aviram. These are the same Datan and Aviram chosen in the assembly who agitated against Moses and Aaron as part of Korach's band. They agitated against the Lord, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them, and the fire consumed the 250 men, and they became an example. But the sons of Korach did not die. You might have had a sense that the sons of Korach died there, but according to this, they did not. And the census goes on, various clans, various tribes, and we wind up on verse 31 with the total of 601,730, right? And then God says to Moses, among these shall the land be apportioned as shares according to the listed names. With larger groups, increase the share. With smaller groups, reduce the share. Each is to be assigned its share according to its enrollment. In other words, the land will be divided among the tribes according to the size of the tribe. We've counted all these people. And that's how we'll divide up the land. And you know that this is essentially what happens. And you can look at a map of Israel after the conquest, and you can see where each tribe is. The tribe of Benjamin, which is the smallest, gets the smallest section, and so on. The land is to be apportioned by lot. So who gets land? This is within the tribe, right? How are you, your family, going to get your piece of land so you get a sense, by the way, we're really ready to go now. They're going in. We're already talking about where they're going to go. The allotment shall be made according to the listings. Each portion will decide by lot, whether for smaller or larger groups. And now we get the Levites, just as we had at the beginning, a census of the Levites. And then we were told, these are the persons enrolled by Moses and Eleazar the priest who registered the Israelites on the steppes of Moab at the Jordan near Jericho. Among those, there was not one of those enrolled by Moses and Aaron the priest when they recorded the Israelites in the wilderness of Sinai. For the Lord had said to them, they shall die in the wilderness. Not one of them survived, except Caleb, the son of Yefuneh, and Joshua, the son of Nun. There's actually one more who survived, and that, of course, is Moses. He's still around, but he's not going to make it to the promised land. And now we get this great story. The story of the daughters of Zelophehad. Zelophehad is a guy from Manasseh, and we get his genealogy, right? He is the son of Yosef, and he comes forward, and we get the names of his daughters, right? He has, let me find it. So, who are they? They are Machla, Noah, Chagla, Milcah, and Tirzah. Striking that we know their names. We don't get a lot of women's names, right? I mean, this is really unusual. And they come forward and they stand before Moses and Eleazar, the priest, and the princes and the whole people at the entrance to the tent of meeting. And this is what they say. Our father died in the wilderness. He was not one of the faction, Korach's faction, which banded together against the Lord, but he died for his own sin and has left no sons. The rabbis immediately ask, what sin? And they identify him as the one who was gathering sticks on Shabbat, right? Because they never like anonymity. At any rate, doesn't really matter. Let our father's name not be lost to his clan because he had no son. Give us a holding among our father's kinsmen. We want to inherit our father's land. When the land is divided up and there's a lottery, right, our father will have disappeared. Right? So we want to inherit. Moses brings their case before the Lord. Now, this is a scene, right? Because this is land. This is wealth. Everybody's watching. If they get it, somebody else gets less in that tribe, right? So Moses doesn't make a decision. He brings it to the Lord, and God says, Ein benot Zelophehad dobrot. They have spoken correctly, or justly. It's really a striking statement. And I think that there are two levels to it. On one level, it's saying their argument is a just argument. God is accepting this and allowing these women to inherit, which was not something that one saw in antiquity. Usually, women did not inherit. But it's more than that. He said, the way they spoke was good, was right. And you notice the way they spoke. They were respectful. It was public. They made a case. They weren't equivocal. But they didn't challenge Moses' authority. And they didn't challenge God. They simply made their plea. And that really distinguishes them from the other incidents that we've seen in the past where people came with a complaint to Moses and directly challenged Moses and challenged him. So God agrees, and now not only are they going to get it, but the law is going to be changed because of them. Speak to the Israelite people as follows: if a man dies without leaving a son, you shall transfer his property to his daughter. If he has no daughter, you'll assign it to his brothers. If he has no brothers, to his father's brothers. If his father had no brothers, you'll assign his property to the nearest relative, and he will inherit it. So what happens here? This didn't necessarily have to happen, right? I mean, you could say this is a one-time thing. The people are about to go into the land, right? The land is going to be divvied up for the first time. But this goes further than that. In other words, their plea that a daughter should be able to inherit like a son is accepted and becomes a precedent, not just here, but for all time, as it were. Thus shall be the procedure for the Israelites in accordance to the land's command to Moses. All right, and this is a good place. Well, we'll go slightly further. The Lord said to Moses, ascend to the heights of Arim, view the land that I have given to the Israelite people. When you've seen it, you will be gathered to your people just as Aaron was. For in the wilderness of Zin, when the community was contentious, you disobeyed my command to uphold my sanctity by means of water. Those are the waters of Meribah, Kadesh, in the wilderness of Zin. So we're reminded of the story, which we ourselves have studied together. And now God is saying, okay, this is it. We've just talked about how the land is going to be apportioned. You're not going. You're going to go up, you're going to see it, and that's it. Moses says to the Lord, let the source, the breath of all flesh, appoint someone over the community who will go out before them and come in before them. She'll take them out and bring them in, so that the Lord's community will not be like sheep and have no shepherd. Right? And you get a sense of Moses' own sense of his role here. He is a shepherd. They are the flock. He goes before them, he leads them, he brings them back. Single out Joshua. And remember, by the way, Moses' early life, that's what he did. Right? He was a shepherd. He worked for his father-in-law, guarding his sheep. So this metaphor which Moses uses is one that he knows very well. And God says, okay, single out Joshua, the son of Nun, an inspired man, lay your hand on him, have him stand before Eleazar the priest, before the whole community, and commission him in their sight, very publicly. Invest him with some of your authority, right? And so that the whole Israelite community will obey. So this is going to be a transfer of power. Moses is going to lay hands on him. This seems to be the way it is transferred. It's interesting that later tradition, when rabbis are ordained, it is, if you look at the language, let me just find it here. Samachta et yadecha alav. Place, right? What do we call rabbinic ordination? Smicha, from the same root, right? That one generation is transferring authority to. Now, it's not like Moses. The rabbis who ordained don't go and die, right? But this model of investing new leaders with authority comes from here. And it continues to this day in rabbinic ordination, at least in some rabbinic ordinations, and that's why it's called smicha. And he will present himself to Eleazar the priest, who will, on his behalf, seek the decision of the Urim before the Lord. By such instruction, they will go out, and by such instruction, they will come in, he and all the Israelite community. So he's going to be a little different, right? Remember, how did God instruct Moses? he told him. It was, God spoke to Moses. We're not going to get a sense of that now. The next leader is going to be different. He'll have to go to the priests, and there will be a sign. They'll look at the Urim. I'll mention them again next week, and we'll talk a little bit about the Urim. And that's how he will lead. And Moses did as God commanded him. He took Joshua, had him stand before Eleazar the priest and the whole community. He laid his hands upon him and commissioned him as the Lord had spoken. Okay, so what do we see here? First Pinchas, then the apportionment of the land. Then we saw Zelophehad, and finally now the appointment of Moses' successor. I'm going to open it up one more time. Any questions or comments on anything we did today? Yeah, Saul.
I want to go back to the end of Balak. I just want to go back to chapter 25, verse 8, where it says, Vayavo achar ish Yisrael el hakuva, vayikor et shnehem et ish Yisrael ve'et ha'isha el kavata. They mentioned the part of the body where the spear went into her belly, but it didn't mention anything about him. Did it go through him and then into her?
The assumption here, you'll forgive me for this image, right? It's a kind of shish kebab. Okay. They are actually coupling when this happens, right? So he spears through both of them. So that, I think that's the sense here. And again, forgive me, it's a grotesque image. All right, any other questions or comments here? Okay, well, we will continue with this story next week. As always, I invite, if you do have questions or thoughts during the week, feel free to email me. Our numbers have fallen off a bit, so if you have friends who used to come and you want to remind them, I'd love to see them again. And of course, I know a number of people are also looking at the recordings. So, okay, have a great week, and as usual, it's a great pleasure to teach you.
Thank you
Bye.
so much,
Thank
Rabbi.
you.
Thank
It's a
you.
pleasure to learn
My
with you.
pleasure. Take care now.